The COVID-19 pandemic has brought in uncertain uh, disruption, and the uncertainty level on personal, professional, and social fronts are high as we couldn't ever expect. As procurement leaders, you as well are at the forefront of this situation, and I want to compliment you for the great efforts and commitment. I understand every day we have to take courageous decisions to balance the interest of our businesses and the safety and well-being of our people. When it comes to talking, there's so much we can, but when it comes to taking decisions, there are no easy answers. Good morning and welcome to CPO Innovation Live. I'm Razum Rajan, your moderator, and today, as you all know, we have an extremely revolutionizing and pressing topic, and I'm very excited to welcome you all again to have a conversation on the Black Swan Menace and the Procurement Crackdown. What has happened over the past 3 months has booked its place on important historical chapters, and what is set to be on stage for the next 3 months or so will be no less historical. I'd want to start with a small story from a personal experience whilst conceptualizing this procurement inspiring platform as an initiative by CPO Innovation, where we are constantly getting key experts to share their best practices via articles, stories, interviews, live talk shows with an audience of their industry peers that counts in our community more than 350,000 people globally. Something took over me as I started to have an involuntary musical imagery out of fear or anxiety. I cannot really tell you from where did it come, but there is a song that has been playing in a loop in my head. I want to read a couple of lines for you. It goes, Que sera, whatever will be. The future is not ours to see. Que sera, what will be. As I start today's discussion, I wish we can all embody the spirit of this song by Doris Day and wait for a brighter tomorrow very soon. I think all of us as businesses and individuals are battling the impact of shortage of inventories, and this has been a rough road that deteriorated, and here we stand still navigating through the fourth phase of Indian lockdown. Crisis tests and reveal true leaders, and this by any definition, like I said, is the perfect storm. The pandemic has plunged the world in a state of complete shutdown, and the reality is that no one was ready for it. The biggest shock that's troubling people across is the uncertainty, and nobody knows what's the long term impact yet. And like I love to say, it's in this cauldron that leaders emerge. In today's discussion, similar to what we did in the last episode, we want to zoom out a little bit and take a look at the bigger picture and the new normal in the future, and how will it be defined, and how will the elevated platform be more important for procurement leaders as they play their part, how they look in a current and post-COVID world, and how they meet the new challenges and overcome them. In today's panel, we have the privilege to have with us Shailesh Tanki, CPSCM. Uh, Shailesh is currently the CPO with Axis Bank. He's a result-oriented professional with over 20 years of multi-functional experience in operations, supply chain management, vendor development, strategic sourcing, and project procurement in manufacturing as well as service sectors. Welcome, Shailesh.
Thank you, Raju.
Moving on to our next panelist, we have Pradeep Vedula. He's a procurement and supply chain expert with vast and deep procurement experience. An alumnus of IIM Bangalore, he's worked across consumer goods, pharma chemicals, apparel, and agricultural commodity industries. Welcome, Pradeep.
Thanks a lot, Azum. Hi, everyone. Hi, Shailesh.
Hello,
Good to
Pradeep.
see you. Alongside, we also have today with us Dinesh Kumar, CPSCM, Senior Director of Global Procurement at CL Technologies. He has 24 years experience leading global procurement teams in complex matrix global organization with 12 years consultancy and IT procurement and 10 years of indirect procurement delivery, uh, working across client engagement lifecycle. He's extensive on the ground experience across Europe, North America, and APAC. Dinesh will be joining us shortly. We also have today Rahul Gupta, Vice President Procurement at Amway. Rahul carries a total experience of 23 years, last 13 years with Amway and 10 years with GSK Consumer prior to Amway. He comes with a solid experience in commodity procurement, capex procurement, e-sourcing, business partnering, contract manufacturing, supply chain planning, change management, and risk management. Welcome, Rahul.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Razum.
Perfect. Now, as we move forward, and before we have a line of experts to join us today, and we have a packed agenda to cover. So as I said, we'll be zooming out a little bit today, and that zooming out will be by design, because we believe that at times we really need to zoom out to take the bigger picture so that we can then zoom in and take the right decision to understand how aligned we are with the larger picture and the larger objective. We'll be focusing on that future that that has been created by a completely unexpected pandemic, and we'll invite our panelists to not only help us design and think through to visualize the picture, but to also help us to think through what will be our new roles as procurement leaders as we go along lockdown 4.0 and ahead. Shailesh, I'd start with my question from you. See, from a procurement standpoint, uh, you've been one of the most senior executive in the industry, and you have seen all the way through Capgemini and now with your current organization. How did the news come out to you about the pandemic, and what was your initial response?
Thanks, Razum. In fact, first of all, I wish everybody on this call and their loved ones are safe and healthy. Because while we keep talking about pandemic, I think the first thing we should focus is how are we doing in this pandemic, and let not the pandemic overtake us. So, Razum, I think reactions to this pandemic, I don't think anybody would have expected, because I think this is once in a lifetime for each one of us, and I'm sure we are not going to see it again in this lifetime for sure. So the reaction was not at all something that could have been planned, and it was definitely something which nobody would have even thought of. What would we do? Because the first fact itself was that what is it that is coming our way was not known. Now, as a procurement
Mm,
professional, I think even I have faced this for the first time, although you say that I have a long history of experience, but that doesn't seem true. Uh, it is a first of its kind experience. As procurement people, we are known to predictive supply chains, we are known to predictive demand handling, we are known to establish supplier relationships, but we never were able to think about a situation where we all of us will be disconnected from each other, and still we will have to deliver. So a supply chain, first of all, is something which is connected. And the first surprise that we got out of this pandemic was that suddenly we are disconnected completely and we still have to deliver. So I think that was the
mm,
first shock. And the reaction, of course, was how do we stay connected when we are not? And how do we continue to meet the expectations at an organization level? Because the pandemic stopped us from operating, but the businesses never stopped. So we had to still find ways to continue what we are doing.
okay. And what perceptions did you have of its impact on procurement, and what do you feel now has changed that we are 4 months down?
So the first perception was, of course, yes, that everything is coming to a standstill. And initial 2 weeks, everybody was trying to figure out what is it that we need to do and how are things panning out. Obviously, nobody knew that in the initial 2 weeks. But now I think when we look back at it, I would say, as a procurement fraternity, I'm sure each one of us is more prepared than what we were 2 months back. And if something of this sort either continues or comes again, we would be more prepared.
Okay. Rahul, your opening comments, please. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, first of all, to be very honest, I never thought it is going to become the size and scale it became. Uh, I think, like most of us, perhaps, I also took it little non-seriously, and various theories floating around. Temperatures increase, it is going to go away. We have a great immunity. It is not going to come. So that the perfect curve that we normally follow of. Like in any change management, it's a denial stage. We said no, not going to touch us. Nothing is going to go wrong. So I went through that phase, and then the acceptance phase that, oh, it looks real. And you start seeing things getting impacted, and curfews in some areas, lockdowns. You start seeing your near and dear ones getting impacted, and then you you suddenly read one morning I read a Washington Post article which said that if you are living in New York, so either somebody in your family or somebody is already impacted by this pandemic. So that's when you realize that oh, this is a much seriouser problem than we could think of. So kind of obviously on a personal front, I did take some time accepting it, and I think it was a big change, a change in terms of the way we work, change in terms of the way we carry our work with respect to working from home. So many of us have used to working at home in phases, like one day in a week or twice a week, but working from home consistently, continuously, it is kind of not an easy skill. So I see there was a lot of burnout with a lot of people initially. They had no clue how to work from home, managing kids at home, managing household chores. So there is so much to learn. So I kind of as I look back, I think I have thoroughly enjoyed, and I could pick up my list of like 15, 20 skills which I never had. I have been able to acquire, which are helping me both in my personal and professional life. So I have kind of tend to learn from this pandemic so far, if I can say that, Razum. Thank you.
Okay. Pradeep, your thoughts, please.
Hi, Razum. So my entire experience with COVID was, slightly a more directly connected experience. And the reason I say this is because we had a sourcing team based out of China, actually based out of Shanghai, and we had just closed down for the Chinese New Year holidays at that point of time. The gentleman leading that team was an Indian guy with almost 20 years of experience and had earlier been in China for 4 to 5 years. Came back with his family, and one of our team members actually went back to Wuhan because that was her native place. And we had started to prepone supplies only on account of the Chinese New Year holidays. And that's when this entire news about the COVID breakout in Wuhan and spreading very rapidly, and all that news broke. And like Shailesh shared and like Rahul shared, even though we had a China office, we were really not prepared for the length of time it is impacting us or the scale at which it is impacting us. In fact, I'll share with you one of our first actions the moment we heard, that this is getting into some kind of a serious issue within China. Our first actions were to expedite supplies from China.
Okay.
We never really imagined that we should probably do the same thing for supplies from within India. Because we never imagined it will come this fast, at this scale, and impact supply chains within India itself. So even though like there was probably were a little bit ahead of other organizations, who did not have a direct sourcing office in China, etc., but yet we were unprepared to the extent that we probably should have been, given the scale of this event. And in the last 3 months, there's a lot of actions that we have taken, or a lot of impact that we have seen in terms of how we are managing our procurements. I'll just probably share a couple of points. We had already started an initiative for China de-risking, and that was because of the peculiar nature of the chemical industry. Till 2010, India had a fairly strong or a relatively strong value chain for chemical intermediates within India itself. But a lot of these guys were small scale players based out of Gujarat, based out of Maharashtra, etc. In fact, our own organization used to make a lot of pigment intermediates that we today buy from outside. 2010, China became such a big challenge in terms of cost and scale that entire value chains got wiped out of India. And our sourcing shifted dramatically in favor of buying from China. Last December, we were doing a risk assessment. And this was just from a point of view of, okay, which regions are we buying from, which countries, how many suppliers, how many tier 2 suppliers, like what does the value chain look after my supplier or beneath my suppliers, this thing. And we realized there are certain categories where it is vulnerable. And we started looking at China de-risking options. But the sense of urgency and the pace it has picked up in the last 3 months, understandably, is something that was unprecedented. Then, there has been the level of communication and the level of monitoring and the level of intelligence gathering for the on-ground situation in China as the crisis unfolded but also was something which was unprecedented. In fact, we were tracking province by province cases, province by province deaths, province by province restrictions and regulations, the number of the utilization scale at which companies are being allowed to. So this kind of being glued in to the vendor's own supply chain is something that we have never done before, probably never felt the need for before. And this has completely altered the way we look at ourselves as a procurement function. We look at our vendors as business partners. We look at risk in the entire organization. This completely changed perceptions around these three critical areas.
Well, that's how it is. Unprecedented times call for innovations and new measures. We move on to talking about the new circumstances. And Shailesh, I'd want to start with you. Uh, See, under normal circumstances, the global market regulates itself. It's a known fact. But we are now in a very strange situation where there is neither an automatic correction of the markets nor a global regulation in place to address market failures. And as COVID-19 is progressing very rapidly, new cases are being reported, making assessment of needs, what needs to be done, is being very difficult. And as the world navigates through the dawn and dusk of COVID-19 crisis, what I'd want to understand from you out of these circumstances, what have been the biggest challenges this outbreak has had to procurement, right through its occurrence in China until lockdown 4.0? Shailesh, your views, please. The biggest challenges
Yeah, so I
the
think,
outbreak.
of course, things.
Hmm.
Sorry, can I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think how it was evolving every week was giving a different picture, as you rightly said, right? What happened in Wuhan versus till the day the lockdown happened in India. Of course, while monitoring the situation, the needs are changing every day. So it was not anticipated to what extent it would go. Especially how would organizations operate in literally disconnected environments where I predominantly worked. Work from home is not as familiar as it is in certain other parts of the world or certain other sections of the industry. So, in fact, what would we do if we have to sit at home and work? Itself was a big question in terms of procurement because setting up the infrastructure, getting the things that you need to enable each and every employee to be connected from home was immediately a task that was given to procurement. So while the work was slowing down, I would say that our world of procurement was gearing up and completely going opposite in terms of setting things up so that we are able to function. The second challenge was immediately while we want to procure things and set the infrastructure up, is it available in the market? How would we make it available? And the entire supply chain was handicapped. Considering India as an economy, a lot of infrastructure that we buy comes from countries like China, and that's the place where the situation first broke. So how would you organize for all the infrastructure that you need? And immediately when the lockdown was announced in India, that day itself, everything is coming to a standstill. But the need was still standing in front of us and staring at us in terms of how do you still get things operational? How do you still get services delivered by your suppliers and products delivered by your suppliers? How would you internally, as an organization, enable work from home? And how would you enable your client-facing community to be able to still continue to do something and meet the client needs? Because nowhere in these unprecedented times, any one of us even thought of disconnecting ourselves from the client. So I think it kept evolving, further evolving and further complicating it, and we kept changing and we kept finding new avenues, but somehow we had to make it work. So this is how I think the weeks moved. And as procurement fraternity, I think we learned a lot when the world was slowing down. And expectations from the management, from procurement, were completely different around these times. It was not what it is always to be as an expectation. Now it was like stepping into the forefront, taking the lead, enabling things, and ensuring that the organization will be able to continue to operate while obviously keeping an eye on the cost, because the unprecedented times were raising big questions about how would the economic situation be, and as procurement, we are the first ones who are supposed to think about it. So it was like walking on a tightrope.
Okay. Rahul, your views. What were the sum of challenges that you faced?
Yeah, sure. So I think I would say that four key challenges, if I have to clearly specify. One, as an organization, we have almost 30% of our raws, they come from outside the country. So importation, we saw, we still continue to see a lot of issues on the ports. So there are problems on the ground. The officers, assessing officers are coming for a very short span of time in the day, and there are the passes for the chas and other agents are not being issued to largely, so there are issues in imports. There are issues in transportation, and I'll cover that little separately. There are issues on manpower, or there were, and cash flows. So if I have to pick up four areas, I would say imports, transportation, manpower, and cash flows. And how this pandemic changes our life on an hourly basis. I just want to pick up an example of transportation. So when the initial lockdown 1.0, 2.0 was announced in India, so we had an issue of arranging, the vehicles are there, the fleet is there, but the drivers are missing. So, we don't know where the people are. So finally people got arranged. And, then suddenly we realized something which was taking 7 days to reach our plants, it is now reaching in 3 or 4 days, because there is no vehicle on the road, there is nobody to stop. So, the goods were moving very fast. So there is no people, and so it was only the freight vehicle, so it was moving very fast. And look at the situation in the last 10 days on the ground. Every single transportation vehicle is actually taking 2 or 3 times more time, and the very simple reason is there are so many barricades on the way, wherein police is just checking. I hope they are not carrying any migrant laborers in the vehicle. So that's where I like to pick up that the way challenges change in the transportation industry. I mean, nobody could have thought of that. If the roads are empty, how much time would it take from Mumbai to a Chennai? We all know it is very calculative and it should reach very fast. But it is impossible to, forecast that how many times the truck or the vehicle is going to be stopped, and every single, bag and drum is going to be taken out, because the police genuinely wants to check if there are no migrants, hiding in the vehicles, because, so that has been an issue. So that's where, I would say, and that what's give kick to a lot of supply chain professionals like us, that there is a new challenge coming out every moment, every second. And that's what I have really liked and learned in the last few months from this challenge. Thank you, Razum.
Okay. Thank you, Rahul. And in the meanwhile, we have Nat Parmeswaran, Group Vice President, Global Procurement and Supply Chain from USG Boral Building Products, joining us. Welcome, Nat.
Hi, Razul. Thank you for having me.
Okay. And we also have Suresh TH, Sourcing and Supply Chain Director, India at PWAC. Welcome, Suresh.
Hi, Nazum. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and glad to be here as a panelist.
Hi, Suresh.
Welcome.
Hi, Nat.
Hey, guys.
Hi.
So moving forward, we want to know from you, Nat, first. What are some of the biggest challenges that you faced from the moment you've heard of this pandemic until lockdown 4.0? That's the current times. How did you think the problem would be, and what challenges would come, and how has the reality come out between the journey?
Okay. Well, I'll answer from a more of an Asian perspective. My operations run across Asia, Australia, China, Korea, India, and the Middle East. So what I would first say is the impact of this is non-linear, right? So what happened in one country does not replicate itself in a different country. It replicates itself in a different manner in terms of the challenges. When China went into lockdown, what impacted us the most was not the China operations itself, because that's within the lockdown envelope. What impacted us was the ability to get commodities from China, raw materials, which I deal with, to other countries that are dependent on China raw materials, right? So very soon we needed to pull our book on our risk mitigation strategies. So I have a word there on risk mitigation itself. Couple of years ago, we started doing business risk mitigation on sourced products, and that was for a very different reason. When I operate across 12 countries, I found that certain key commodities, we were single sourced, and single sourcing is always a risk in the supply chain scheme of things. So that was the driver for us to create a risk mitigation strategy to kind of diversify our supply base. We never expected that we would have to use that playbook in a pandemic scenario. So we did a lot of strategic business risk management in terms of diversifying our suppliers. But here is the challenge. Even with global players, even if you distribute your supply base, the suppliers end up being in China. So I can diversify my risk by having different suppliers in different regions of China, but that doesn't solve the risk that happened this time around when China entirely went into a lockdown. So part of it, you can execute your playbook to the extent that you can in terms of shifting to plan B for suppliers that are in a different country and execute from there. But then part of it, you have to think on your feet, in terms of what do we do? I think there's a lot of lessons learned on the reactive side of things. And at some other point during the session, I can kind of go through some of the learnings. The proactive side is easier, so because you have a playbook, you have a plan, you know how to execute it. The reactive side is where I think the challenges are, and that's where we garner a lot of learnings as well.
Perfect. Suresh, your views, please.
Yeah. So after this pandemic, as per everyone's information, this entire world is stuck. So the same way, even a co-working space also goes totally stuck. And unfortunately, we couldn't able to open any buildings. There's no members are moving into the buildings. So the entire is stuck. The same way as a procurement, I'm focusing on the future buildings. So the entire construction works has got stuck. So now that new rule from the government in the 3.0, we just started some works and all these things. Unfortunately, there is no workers around any state and anything. There was no migrant employees. Everybody moved from the states. Almost not even 2 to 3% laborers are there in the state to start any kind of products. And apart from that, there are a lot of restriction from the government. There's distancing and there's additional PPEs and all these things. And more on that, there is nobody's ready to start the function because of the anxiety. Nobody's ready to reach the site. So this is more than the project and the cost and money, salary, there's people, the scarcity and the life. The life is more important. So there's a reason we are also giving the support to all the vendors. We are talking to all the vendors. So we are just giving the boost to them. So we are going to open the buildings. Very soon we are going to start a construction, how we are going to manage. But nobody's having the clue when this laborers is coming back to the states. So this is the major challenge. And particularly we are based out of Bangalore, the corporate office. Even almost last 15 days, they are sending the migrant laborers to their natives. So I hope today also more than 5,000 employees they're sending back to their natives. So I don't know when this situation is going to change. And we can still start the work with this local employees, the local laborers, but not 100%. Definitely is hardly is a 2 to 3%. So we work is one of the clients. So same way, the lot of builders and real estate players they're in the market. So they are also having the same struggle in the industry and getting the laborers and getting the equipments on time. The movements, the transportation is more important. They cannot able to arrange the independent vehicle to the people to reach the location. So earlier they're arranging the bulk transport. So now that is also going to be restricted. So this is a major challenge. And apart from this, the raw material cost increase. Suddenly, particularly in this construction industry, cement cost increase almost 33% and steel price increase 13%. So how we are going to manage that scenario and how we are going to manage that signed contract. So now all the partners and vendors are coming back to revisit the contract. So this is already budgeted. So we are in trouble how we are going to mitigate these things in the future. And apart from that, the COVID measures in sight. So how it is going to happen? and the force majeure clauses in all the agreements should be revisited, which will be managing that COVID situation. So this is the real challenge what we are facing as on today.
Okay, perfect. Great explanation. In the meantime, we have been joined by Steve Rubala. Steve is the EGM and Chief Property and Procurement Officer at National Australia Bank Limited. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Hi, Steve.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are.
Okay, so Steve has joined us from Australia. Steve, my question to start with you here is, until the beginning of the pandemic, when the news came out, up to the time now, how has been the journey? What were the biggest challenges that you've come across over the last 4 months?
Wow, I was hoping for an easy question to start. I guess there are no easy questions with respect to the pandemic. I think the biggest challenge was coming to terms with what it is that we probably should have been aware of, but actually we're kind of face palming ourselves with when we thought, gee, that this should have been really eminently obvious, yet we didn't actually track, monitor, and manage these things because we were happy to say, right, is a BCP plan in place, business continuity plan? Yes. Do we have business continuity management measures? Yes. What I think we ran into a bit of, or a number of challenges with was really around the, the third and fourth party risks and how it is that those actually played off of each other. Something that I think was probably the biggest one was, of all of the things that we were thinking about in terms of pandemic risk, it never occurred to us that you would have something that is as virulent as the virus. That we would have as significant a challenge with how it is that these played off of each other, and also what that really meant in terms of, well, if this fails here because suddenly overnight a government is saying you can't travel, how that would quickly ramify across like a number of other things that we did, especially considering that we tend to source not from a supply chain perspective but from a services perspective. And if for whatever reason our people can't log in remotely, all of a sudden we're dead in the water. So we really had to scramble and frankly take the amount of work that we had across suppliers, take some of it back in-house that was super critical. And then the other things that were actually sort of maintenance, push that back out to some of our partners so they could do that, on couches at home or whatever, where security and other considerations weren't as big. But in retrospect, and this is the part that I wanted to really leave everybody with, in retrospect, it seems so obvious that we should have been thinking about that. But I think risk management is fascinating because it's sort of like driving the car at 120 kph, looking through the rearview mirror. You're always considering what's behind you, and so you're avoiding what it is that you almost hit or you just hit, rather than what it is that's in front of you. And that's actually been a real wake-up call, I think, for a few different lines of business, as well as for my team generally, that we shouldn't take for granted that somebody else is already across the details.
Okay. We now go on to understanding that the problems. We've understood the problems here. Now I'll just try and measure this as the second part of the question. Each one of us we've already shared our challenges. Now, what was the one best measure that you've taken as a response to COVID-19 to reduce this impact on your workforce? Steve, your views.
The one single measure that's had the biggest impact, I'd say it's been understanding who it is that's working on what on a vendor by vendor basis, and also which things we've actually retained internally. because that exchange that I talked about in terms of taking some things back in and pushing other things out, practically overnight. If somebody were to say, do we have a services register that says this is exactly what's being done by whom and where it's being done? We had to create that. It's a little embarrassing. We had to create that based on bits of information we had. We had to do it practically like within 2 hours to understand what the real implications would be. That was the biggest impact on our people, where, there's a tendency to think of services as being provided for you, and there's KPIs and SLAs or KPIs and SLAs, and you understand sort of, what it is that success looks like under the contract. But then you can pretty much tear those up if, for whatever reason, you don't have a clear end-to-end understanding of your process flows and how many organizations as well as your internal employees touch that. That was a real key learning for us, I'd say.
Suresh, any views from you on this?
Yeah, the measures what we are taking, I'm just not talking from the client point of view, I'm just talking from the vendor point of view also. So instead of looking for a savings on a price, we are just looking or focusing on total cost of ownership. So this is the way we need to look into this, since I don't want to put everything to my vendors to take the cost, all these things. They are also facing the same scenario in the market. So we are just focusing on the total cost of ownership instead of the product costing. So the negotiation is going to be a little hard now. So we need to put some strategy behind and reducing their profit margin instead of going with the manufacturing cost. So this is the strategy we are just planning to implement. And the same way that classes, as I said earlier itself, that the first major classes has to be revisited, and we need to be put some COVID classes, whatever is going to be, it's a mutually understandable by the partners and the client, both the way.
Okay. Nat, my next question will be with your current role. You oversee procurement area for about 12 countries, if I'm not wrong. Could you walk us through some of your approaches in this global crisis, both as your pre-COVID preparedness and as a response? I mean, the proactive ones versus the reactive approaches during the crisis.
Sure. For which I need to probably step back a couple of years. When USG Boral as an entity of 12 countries, we were pretty much a decentralized procurement organization until a few years back. And the decentralized organization, from a tactical standpoint, execution standpoint. But then, a few years ago, we recognized in terms of leverage with our suppliers, because we buy commodities. At the end of the day, global leverage of volumes certainly play a part. So we have what is called a center-led procurement organization. It's not a centralized procurement organization. There's a fine distinction there. So we are a center-led organization where I drive the strategy, drive the governance, supply chain finance, supply chain. Part of that is supply chain risk mitigation as well. That comes into the leadership role of what we do. So like I said, earlier on during my introduction, we had business risk mitigation plans that we had crafted, put together. But like Steve said and Suresh said, you have your best knowledge until the point you know what's going to hit you, right? So you've covered for all the things that you know, but there are things that you do not know. That's where how fast you react and how resilient you are when you don't have a process becomes very important. And that's where we are at. So the things that we had a playbook already in place in terms of managing 12 countries and shifting risks, if you may, from supplier A to supplier B in a different country to say, to supply the same raw materials, that works like a charm, right? What didn't work, I wouldn't say what didn't work. What was a challenge was you are asked to source things that you were never asked to source before, like sanitizers, like masks, like PPEs, So you have to really scramble, react, but react fast, which is where, as leaders of procurement, what comes into play there is resilience, rapid decision making, and empowerment of your teams, right? So I told my people, don't wait for emails. If you have something going on, call. Things like that. Simple things like that, which eventually, as we learn through this process, will become part of our playbook in the future. So I think that's the key lesson we learned in terms of managing multiple geographies. And then, like I also said, one final point, not all geographies are hit the same way. The lockdown in India is much more challenging, as all of you had mentioned. A lockdown in Thailand is less restrictive in terms of the challenges. So the way that you approach different countries in terms of your execution of risk mitigation strategy needs to be fine-tuned real time. And that's where data, communication, collaboration becomes the key. So you trust your people to collaborate, you trust the data that you see so that you can react fast and make decisions fast.
Okay. Shailesh, any comments from you on your proactive versus the reactive approaches during the crisis, the strategic versus rapid ones?
I will talk about something which was strategic. So being a service sector and related to financial services, there are always decisions that we take towards make versus buy, in-source versus outsource. And this situation made us reverse most of our decisions. So the make versus buy philosophy itself for us was upside down, and we started quickly thinking about things that we could quickly insource so that we are able to do it on our own and depend less on suppliers. And simultaneously, we were thinking about how will we take care of the services which will still continue to be outsourced and still delivered by our suppliers. So a radical shift in the strategy itself, so to say.
Okay. Rahul, your views?
Sure. So I think from my perspective, the first things first, business continuity had to be protected. So we are in a business of nutrition and home care products. So we saw some of the products forecasting change by like 5 to 7 times, which is very unprecedented. So we cannot talk of only a BCP or a plan in place unless we. So that to me was oxygen. So arranging materials, way ahead of time, and some of the materials we sourced was like almost in normal circumstances 1.5 years of demand, which we sourced in a month's time. So I think the key there, which worked for us as an organization, is we have a deep-seated process of a very strong supplier relationship management. So I think that came up very handy. You will be surprised that with many of our business partners, we may not be there in the top 20 or 25 largest customers for many of them. But that doesn't mean that we are not important to them. So with many of these business partners, whenever they started their plant after the lockdown, so what I learned from my team was that our batches were started, at the number 1 or a number 2 or a number 3. So in terms of priority, so this clearly, is one. And to me, investing on supplier relationship cannot happen only in the COVID time. So there is a lot of investment and a structured work that we have done in the past that has worked for us. The second thing which we have done differently is we have launched some SKUs, like one of you mentioned about the sanitizer. So it fits very well with our business line. So we were able to launch a sanitizer in like 31 days as I speak. So the point there is, if I look at an internal benchmark of a quickest ever launch with Amway India prior to this sanitizer, probably we could have kind of had a lot of applause for anything we would have launched in like 5 to 6 months. That would have been like a wow and a big thing and a great thing. And we would have celebrated, gone out for a dinner or a lunch. At this time, there was no going out for a lunch or a dinner, everything virtual, including the recognitions and pat on the back. But still, the team delivered. So I would say that is another piece. The third aspect which I want to touch upon, which is very important for us, who all of us who manage large and virtual teams. I think personally for me, if I have like 500 plus suppliers, I cannot talk to all of them. So it's my team talking to all of them. So what I have consciously done over the last 2 months is I have consciously increased my engagements with my team. So I am talking to them much more often, one-on-one calls, group calls. So I never had structured 10:30 morning meetings with my direct reports. I never had meetings with the whole team so often. I never had skip level meetings with the team so often, because if the annual process is like a 6-month mid-year review, so you would at best talk to your skip levels, second or third levels, maybe once in 6 months. But now I have increased that frequency. So those kinds of things, is the changes that I have brought about, which I think are paying the dividends for us. So that's largely from my perspective, Razo. Thank you.
Okay. Steve, your views on this?
You know, it's interesting to consider how it is that we conceptualize and respond to such matters. I actually, when I took up my role over 2 years ago, pressed into something that I called supplier entanglement, and basically sort of the blind alley you can get into if you're hammering really hard on price, and you say, you know, we have the best price from one supplier, and you know, we've kind of tested whether or not they have an ability to actually service us really well. And you actually blind yourself to the fact that if, for whatever happens, the unanticipated happens, which it always does, because if all of us could anticipate the unanticipatable, I think we'd probably run the planet instead of just live on it. But in any event, I actually had asked questions about how we do risk management and mitigation in our day-to-day to make sure that we're planning for it. And it was interesting because, you know, the response was, well, that's interesting, that's, you know, fascinating, but we'll keep that in mind. But meanwhile, it's all about price. What I actually specifically pressed into as a result of the pandemic and what it is that we were seeing, not only with things like PPE, but also just across the board, was we actually need to have, you know, our own metrics to measure how it is that we are giving up some aspects of operational resilience in exchange for price without actually pricing what that means. So we don't have actually a metric to say, well, you know, for that additional savings of, you know, $1 per widget, what is the opportunity cost going to be of not being able to get those cheaper widgets overnight or within a week? And especially when, you know, a business like ours, you know, you're facing customers every day across 600 odd branches. If there's no sanitizer or wipes or anything else, or, you know, PPE more broadly, then nobody wants to come into the branch. They're not transacting business, and our business just sort of ends. Nobody asked those questions before. So I think it's interesting where it's an opportunity to sort of wake everybody up to what it is that they should be thinking about if they're going end to end. Like, what are the ramifications of how it is we've done things, and take a fresh look at it, and frankly do a bit of stock taking and go, right, so it's not important to make sure we're planning for the next pandemic, as it's not as important as making sure we are planning so that whatever happens, that resiliency is built into what it is that we do. And that has huge impact for you know, my team more broadly, and certainly for the organization. I don't know if others have had similar thoughts there.
Okay, no, I agree. Coming back to Rahul, and talking about the disruptions. See, the procurement system disruptions are really the new normal, if I may say that. And if there's any solution to this, it's to have a more resilient and a more agile procurement and sourcing system.
Absolutely.
But what's key here is your procurement talent. So Rahul, my question to you is your procurement team, the talent at your department, is it ready to adapt to the new normal? And if not, if there's anything that you need to still achieve, how are you making them future ready? What steps in people development?
Sure. So I think, I mean, one of the fundamental shifts that I did in recruiting people close to 4 years ago was that if you look at my recruitments till 4 years ago, if I'm in FMCG, I would only look at CVs from FMCG. It was very clear. If I have a vacancy in the home care side, I need somebody from a Unilever or a P&G. If I have a vacancy in the nutrition side, I would prefer somebody from a GSK, Nestle. So that's, you know, that's how I was initially born and brought up in my career. And I think that one fundamental shift that I did early on in my career is helping us today, because today, you know, in our recruitment, we are looking at the DNA of an individual. So we have people from consultancy background, from tire industry, from, you know, automotive, durable. So I mean, you name an industry and we have people. And are we dealing in any of those segments? The answer is no. But what I have felt is that every industry has its unique nuances, which only perhaps unless you burn your fingers and slog in an industry, like what you can learn from a guy who has worked hardcore in a telecom industry, probably a FMCG guy all through his life will not be able to pick up. So I think one big shift, and it is risky. 9 out of 10 recruitments have worked for me. One has been a failure. Let me accept that. It was like absolute chaos, and this guy didn't know what to how to react. So yeah, so there was a mistake which could happen. So I would say one of my first, and this again, Razum, to your question, this cannot be done overnight. So we have to think early on, we have to prepare early on. So that is one. Having a cross sectoral industry experience is one thing. The second aspect, which I think which I have focused on and which has worked for me, is what is the average age of your team? So if the average age of your team is increasing with every year, then perhaps while we are adding a lot of years of experience, we are missing the young brigade, and a lot of ideas do come from young brigade. So again, statistically speaking, if you look at my average age of my team, while I have retained 10 to 12 people in the 30 odd team who have been with us for the last 8 or 10 years, still the average age has come down. So which is only possible we are recruiting freshers, because uh, let's be honest, the risk taking capability of a fresher is going to be and very different than somebody who has done that. This is how it has worked. So there is no unlearning needing there. And the other thing with the youngsters is they don't want to be politically correct all the time. When they have to, they just speak their mind out. If they don't like what you say, 9:30 in the morning, they don't care. They say, sorry, I don't think you're right. It's not that being always because boss is saying you have to be perfect, you have to be politically correct. So if you have a right mix of people, I think cross industry experience and right set of people in the group, that is certainly the two ingredients for success, which we have built at Amway. The third thing which I would say, which obviously we and the whole world will keep focusing on going forward, is on the risk mitigation. I think as procurement organizations around the globe, all of us have worked on risk mitigation in the past. We have seen examples of case studies of Thailand floods. We have seen Latour, earthquakes. So there are various messages and learnings people have picked up from, these, I would say, regional or local issues. But perhaps, like one of the speakers initially mentioned, I think it was Shailesh, you, who said that this is a kind of a pandemic which we are perhaps seeing once in our lifetime. I think none of us were not geared up for having such a scale. So many of us were geared up. If China stops, what is the plan B? But this is something, plan B is Spain. Even Spain is not working. Plan C is Italy. Even that is not working. US is not working. So I think there will be a fundamental shift needed. Razum, do I have an answer right now? The answer is no, but I think we have started thinking about it, and what happens and how do we gear ourselves if the whole world is impacted. It is not a regional issue. I think we still get out of regional issues very well with a lot of BCPs in place, but when it is a global issue, I think we are struggling, and so are we. So we are currently in process of developing something. It is not ready, so that's what I can share for now. But that's a WIP. But yeah, that is how we will look at problems going forward. Not a one-on-one replacement, because the replacement which we thought of maybe in a bigger mess, if I can say that. So that is how I would answer, Razum, if that helps.
Thank you, Rahul. It definitely helps. Suresh, I'd come to you. Your views on people development from your team, please.
As you're aware, because of this COVID, the most of the project is going to cancel totally. So that way, so definitely I had to reconsider how much work this year we are going to do internally with the teams. So how much volume we are going to take it, and how much seater offices we are going to build. That way we need to we need to restructure our team entirely. That focus, I hope the most of the companies, the industry is doing the same way. So we are also thinking the restructuring the team, and we are just utilizing the knowledge and skill set for this particular level. And most of the third, so instead of the cash flow point of view, we are just looking for some amortization model or rental model for the furnitures. This is the additional initiative what we are taking. And for the most and foremost, the health and safety of the employees is more important. So when the time they are turning back to office, which is more important. So as a leader, this is my third week I'm sitting in office and working. So I'm just giving the boost to the employees to come to office. Since we work the entire India, they have done the precautions as per the government norms on the sanitation and the space distancing, the signages. So we invested a lot to re-evaluate the entire building. So we're in a process to welcome all our members. The same way the employees, the scatterness is still there. So we're just pushing. So when the first day I'm to come to office, out of this 1600 seater office, only 4 people. So almost now the third week is almost some 100 people there in the office. So this is the way we are just planning to push the employees to come to office. And this pandemic, my team, they supported a lot in learning a lot in the industry instead of simply sitting at home. We just had a lot of cross-vertical discussions, how to come out with mitigation, these issues. So this is not one time. I don't think this is the last pandemic we are going to face. Might be tomorrow, some other thing can happen. So how we are coming out from this. So this is the thing we are just working on the back end with the team, and a health and guidelines, again, is increases the cost. Every government, whatever thinking is increasing the cost. How we are going to mitigate that cost? And again, the project timeline is the more thing once. Instead of the 6-month project, now the restriction in the space distancing, my product will go to 12 months maybe. So I cannot able to deploy 300 people in one shot at site. So I can able to manage only the 100 people. So how I'm going to give the building to my client and members in the particular day. So this is the major challenges, but we are still working very closely with my team. So still there is no effect in my team. We are working with the full team. So we are just working how to manage this upcoming project for the whole year and the upcoming year also. So that is the major work you're going right now.
Okay. I'd come to Nat. Nat, you talked about a proactive versus a reactive approach, and to sum up both of your approaches during the crisis, how did such an approach help procurement and supply chain continuity during the pandemic and even now?
Hey, Razum, you came in and out a little bit. Can you repeat that question? I didn't completely get your question.
My question to you is, you've mentioned about a proactive versus a reactive approach. Now, to sum up both of your approaches during the crisis and your preparedness before the pandemic hit, how did such an approach help procurement and supply chain continuity during the pandemic and even now?
Sure. On the proactive, like I said before, on the proactive approach, it's much easier to execute because you're prepared for that, right? So part of your risk mitigation strategy already have processes to execute your proactive strategy. So when China went on a lockdown, the same supply, for the same commodity, I could go to a different country because I had already qualified a supplier there to supply to our entire network of the other 11 countries that were still not in lockdown. That part, I would say the proactive part is easier because you have prepared for it. The reactive part is where you need to be fast, you need to be resilient, and you need to enforce rapid decision making. And also making sure that your team is empowered to make those decisions. So don't wait for permission, ask for forgiveness later, right? So that is the philosophy you need when you are in a reactive mode. Signed off. On the reactive side, you also have suppliers that supply you facing kind of the same challenges that you are with respect to your customers, right? So that's why building these supplier partnership is an investment in the past that you've done that comes to play very, very nicely on the reactive side. So you go back to your suppliers and ask them, how can you help us, in this time of crisis? And that is a key aspect. Like Steve said, if you go to a street and pick out suppliers just because they are low cost, they will never be your partners. They'll be the first one to buck out, when you have a crisis. So building supplier partnerships is an investment that you do proactively so that you can react well when it comes to such a situation where it's a crisis. And being a global company and working across regions, this has helped us. Specifically, I'll give you an example. One of the suppliers that happened to be in China, they went on a lockdown, obviously, and his other supply base also happened to be in a different region of China, which is also under lockdown, so we can, get the supplies. But being a supplier partner with us, they were able to tie in into their global network and get us commodities from Germany, right? So that is the investment that you build that impacts you on the reactive side. So we will still be able to run our plants without shutting them down for lack of raw materials. So I'm proud to say, at least so far, knock on wood, out of our 12 countries, we have not shut down a single line for lack of raw materials. It is the government that sometimes says you can't run your plants because of lockdown, but not for lack of raw materials. And one final point I'll make, resume on the reactive side and the relationships that you build with your suppliers. One of the things that you want to ensure is your own cash flow as well, right? So how do your supplier partners help you manage your cash flow? And I can touch upon certain things, certain key points later if that comes up. But that's where your supplier partners will help you on the crisis side of things.
See, talking about the cash flow and liquidity, Steve, I'd want to ask you, liquidity has never been more important than the current times with given situations. So how do you, as a purchasing executive, plan to balance preserving cash flow with supporting your most critical suppliers as they require help in this most uncertain time?
So I assume that was directed at me. Yes. So it's interesting. I'm especially sensitive to this because one of the big roles of commercial and business banks at a time like this is to make sure that liquidity in the economy is actually being preserved and frankly fostered. It would be counterintuitive, if not counterproductive, for us to fixate on payment terms. And I noticed one of the questions that scrolled by earlier was about indicators of financial distress. As many of you probably recall from the global financial crisis, all the lights were green, even into a month into the GFC, and then suddenly all the lights were red. Indicators are great for some things, just to flag things for closer attention. But when everything is flashing red or everything is flashing green, like the value of that indicator is not really, not really very useful. So actually, I would piggyback on the earlier comment that Nat made that, you have your suppliers who are supplier partners, and you have your vendors. And if it's basically a transactional relationship, then you want to do right by everyone. But frankly, if they're undergoing significant distress and don't want to talk to you about the details and are just sort of telling you, don't worry about it, it's fine, even though it's clear that it's not, those are warning signs. But it's what we found with a couple of partners in particular is the fact that we had invested in that relationship. So we moved from that first phase of cost containment to the second, cooperation, the third, collaboration, and luckily in a couple of cases, the fourth was integration. Those that were in the fourth, our problems were theirs and their problems were ours. And so, in terms of liquidity and cash flow on both sides, we were feeling the same symptoms of the same disease. We just happen to be on different ends of it, and so that's something that we actually work through with them fairly productively. With respect to some others, when it comes to cash flow, it's almost like thinking back to the Great Depression. Why is it that the Great Depression came about? Suddenly everybody was running around saying beggar thy neighbor is perfectly proper and appropriate, because that's how we're going to mitigate our risk. I think, it's very important to make sure that, you're not being profligate with funds or not managing your business very closely. But managing your business very narrowly is not a smart thing to do. You're actually probably going to destroy relationships, supposedly because, you're really having a close look at what it is that your liquidity perspective or your liquidity measures are, when in actual point of fact, what good is all that money going to do you if none of your suppliers actually want to do business with you because, frankly, you've given them one too many bloody noses, or you're being too bloody minded about how it is that you're engaging them. And they say, this doesn't feel like a partnership. In an emergency, we have to help each other out. And if your response to me is you're suddenly concerned about, clause 8.2.7 in our contract about what our rights are under a force majeure event, that's a game you get to play once, but you're going to lose the match. You might win the game and lose the match as a result. But that's my perspective as a financial institution, because obviously, anything that we would do that would be very limiting for our suppliers and our supplier partners, who also in a lot of cases happen to be our customers, would actually be cutting our noses off to spite our faces.
I'm sure Shailesh will, being from the same service sector, will agree to this. But moving on to
he's probably going to correct me. He can correct me on text if he wants to.
No, so
Actually,
before we
Steve,
move on to...
I will correct you, Steve.
So Shailesh, let's have it from you. Your views on this.
So Steve, if I can add, I will not correct, but as I said, I will compliment. And I echo your views completely. And most of the suppliers who helped us out were definitely sitting to the fourth block, where the relationships were so strong that we didn't have to tell each other about what we need to do. And I even found certain suppliers proactively coming and telling us that, hey guys, you will need this. This is what I can do. That's it, nothing in return. So I 100% agree with you, Steve, and I think that's the spirit which we need to build as a procurement fraternity, because gone are the days you had vendors whom you can choose to decide the way you want to. But the current days are predominantly 360-degree relationships, and you never know what will come back to you when. So it's better that we treat each one of them as partners and put our skin in the game of partnership. It doesn't work one way.
See, I could understand the underwriting between both of you. Okay, so before I move on to Suresh, there's a question, Nat, to you, and this is from one of our audience. You've talked about engaging vendors very closely and asking help from vendors. So the question is, does that also mean cost reduction? And when we get back to normalcy, does this imply that they'd be rewarded? Are there incentives for them?
That's a good question, but does not have a linear answer, right? So what I would say is, let me come back from the future in this, right? So in the future, at post pandemic world, there will be a demand shift, and we don't know yet how that demand shift is going to play out. So what I tell my vendors is, at this point, we will work on reallocation of volumes, if that will help. So for a given supplier partner, if they are able to increase the payment terms as a one-time shot, it's not going to be consistent, right? So things that we ask in terms of our improved cash flow and preserving cash is to see if the suppliers are willing and able to give us extended payment terms, let's say from 30 to 45 days, right? Now, if you ask them that, obviously there is something that you also have is, since we don't know how this will play out, I'm also taking more inventories from them so that I don't run out of inventories. That's one way, right? So you take more inventories than your forecast so that you don't run out of inventories, but then at the same time ask for a longer lead time in terms of payment cycle. So that's one way to do it. Right. The other way is to say, for those vendors that are able to help us, vendor partners, supplier partners, vendors are different, right? Supplier partners that are able to help us during this time of the crisis, the reward, we can't explicitly state now as procurement professionals and leaders, but inherently, there could be volume adjustments between your different suppliers that you can work so that you're able to reward the people that stood by you during the time of crisis. There is no perfect science to it. If you just go by spreadsheets, that's not going to answer the question, right? It's more of how you want to build a relationship and how they want to build a relationship with you. And to an extent, we also help our suppliers when they go through difficult time as customers. So all this is part of the bigger ecosystem around supplier relationships that you have invested in the past that is paying you out now.
Okay. Uh, for your answers, that time will tell. I think we'll have to be stay with CPO innovation, with the reports and with. Coming on to Suresh, views, Suresh, on cash liquidity and adding to that, I have a question for you. Is it with revenues falling to almost zero? This is after you've answered your view on the liquidity status. How is the
Yeah.
pressure on fixed cost being handled?
Yeah, that as I said earlier, that fixed cost, we are just, this a plan, we are this capex itself, we are just reducing the cost. Instead of that buying that one shot, we are just planning for a rental and amortization model. So we are just talking to our partners. So we are just, first of all, we are just selecting the partners whom we are going to deal with in over this period. So we are just selecting we have more than 1,200 vendors, but we are just selecting who's the vendor is taking WeWork as a priority. Since most of the vendors, they're doing 80% business with our country, so our company. So that's the reason we are just looking who's our strategic partner. As everyone said, instead of the vendor, name it as I don't want to call anyone as a vendor, these are our partners. So it's a mutually beneficial. We're just looking what is our projection for this whole year. So in projection, instead of the capital investment, how it will give us solve their both the mutually side. So I'm going for the amortization. So I'm ready to pay for you next 5 years for this entire furnitures and categories, the fixed furniture and other loose furnitures and whatever this can be possible. We are just planning to go with the rental model or it's amortization model. So they are also working with the fund flow. It's a fund flow basis, how much we are going to from the company point of view. I don't want to invest in one shot in the initial itself. I'm just looking to bifurcate in the 60 months period. So then it'll be easy. So none of the furniture are going to work more than 7 years. So I'm just looking for 6 years. The other 1 years we can use additionally. So that is the way we are just working the cost, and that we are working closely to our finance department, how to the cash flow is going to be happen. And again, we have enough stocks in warehouses. We are just trying to liquidate the warehouse stocks for this upcoming project instead of importing and buying from other vendors. So it will be reducing our warehouse holding cost itself. So that is the strategy we are looking. So a maximum this whole year we are just trying to use our existing warehouse products. So where we can save almost 30% of our entire product cost here itself. So only that construction material, we are trying to buy it from outside. The rest of the products, whatever interior, the chairs, tables, and whatever furnitures, we are just trying to use our internal storage materials. So this is a strategy we are just using.
Okay. See, we're talking about approaches and what should be done in order to get back to normalcy. But a lot of our solution comes out of our own mindset. So I'd want to understand everybody's view here. Is in a very direct way, I should ask, how have you considered COVID-19 for procurement? And when I ask this question, I just want to add some context, is that CPO innovation has been really focusing on procurement being positioned as a value-added center for profit than being perceived or being a cost center. Now, if we take COVID-19 as a platform to do any change, how are we viewing this pandemic? Is it a disruptor? Is it a creator? Or is it a disruptor? Steve, to start with you.
You give me really good questions. I'm spoiled for choice as to how to answer. I would suggest that what we're really looking at is as with most external challenges that sort of rattle or shake any system that has a lot of interdependencies. You break some connections and you form new ones. I would suggest that it's actually an opportunity for not only some partners with a better way of dealing with these external shocks to the system, or systemic shocks, maybe I should say, as well as innovators within our organizations to actually push forward their agendas, sort of along the lines of what I mentioned before. One of the comments that came through in the questions was, isn't it essentially a trade-off between partnering and cost? And I would suggest actually that it's not. Unless you are not actually monetizing what the opportunity cost is of not building partnerships. There's an easier way to say that. Let me try putting it differently. If you think of partnerships as fluffy and you think of costs as real, then you will always actually say, well, yeah, it's nice to have a partnership when everything's smooth sailing, but at the first sign of trouble, I'm throwing you overboard. That's not a partnership. That's basically sociopathy, I think. So I would suggest that it is an opportunity for us to engage in the kinds of change that under normal circumstances we don't recognize as necessary, but it's really a wake-up call. I would say it's not necessarily disruptive or destructive as much as it is a change, and to the extent that you have robust systems that you've built to deal with it, those systems that worked well get strengthened, and if you didn't have any systems in place, you have to implement them quickly. So I apologize that I've actually chosen a third way between the two choices that you gave me, but that's the way I think about it, at least.
Okay. Shailesh, what are your views? A disruptor, a creator, or a destructor?
Even I would echo C, because it's not destructive, but it's a creator. I think the word you used, Razum, was creator, a creator of opportunity is what I would mix the two words, because these are the times where the procurement fraternity step up from only doing or meeting fulfillment needs. They have to step up as a value-added business enabler. And like you mentioned, Razum, it's gone are the days when we used to be never a part of the budgeting processes, or gone are the days when we never used to be having a seat at the board table. So now the procurement people are doing a much different role than what they were doing. And these kind of situations, people can call it a pandemic or a recession, but we would definitely or should be calling it as an opportunity to improve.
Okay. I changed the question a bit for Nat and Suresh. Nat and Suresh, 350,000 people have to die. COVID-19 becomes the window that procurement has been looking for as an opportunity, as Steve and Shailesh they put forward. It's a creator. How has the primary objectives of procurement leaders taken shape with this opportunity as we've entered into a new decade 5 months back, and now? What primary objectives do you see that CPOs should have now? Suresh, you can start.
Yeah, I can just echo as Steve said, this is the opportunity for the younger generation in procurement. Definitely, they've learned a lot in this COVID situation. So even me also, I never faced in my 23 years of industry this kind of situation. So now I faced a lot. I learned a lot how to mitigate the challenges in procurement, how important in any of the organization. Now entire organization focuses behind procurement. So how we are going to manage that losses, what they had in last 3 months, and how we are going to mitigate that upcoming things, and what is the COVID, post-COVID investments, how we are going to reduce. So there's a lot of focuses there in procurement. So one way I'm saying is the positive on procurement point of view, since every company is focusing procurement, the procurement people is getting more important than in the organization to others. And the same way, the entire procurement team, apart from the normalcy, they're just working towards the pandemic. They're just focusing on each and every category, how to come out of the situation. So not only in the overall cost savings, earlier, now they're looking the percentage, how much they're going to save. Now each and every single penny is calculative. Since every day the company is going in a loss in the sales point of view. So how we are going to manage the sales? So how to come out the sales? We are not in a position to sell, but still we need to manage the sales loss, what we are going to have. So now we are going to try to save in the cost for the procurement side. So that is as of from my time, it's a learning curve for the entire procurement industry.
Sounds good. Nat, your views on this, please.
Yeah. Resume in terms of, I think now, if people haven't recognized in the past, now is the time that people do recognize that procurement is a strategic function, right? So in the past, certain my organization, we always considered it what I call as a strategic sourcing organization, which is what we've built. But not all organizations across the world consider sourcing to be strategic. Now would be the time that they recognize, most organizations recognize that it has indeed become a strategic function. The tasks we do currently to overcome the crisis may be very tactical in nature. But longer term, I think there is enough recognition of the fact that procurement will become a strategic function, and we probably are going to be tied in the hips with our CFOs much more closely than ever before, right? So procurement being a strategic function and procurement finance being part of that is a key aspect going forward. Now, I will also touch upon things that both Suresh, Steve, and Sailesh touched upon a little bit. Is in a post-COVID world, it becomes even more strategic because we don't know what we don't know. Organizations may be moving out of one country to another country because they get better incentives to set up shops in different countries. The whole supply chain ecosystem might undergo change. When such strategic changes happen in the supply chain ecosystem, how do you address those changes within your organization in terms of impact? That needs a strategic organization to absorb and create strategies for your own organization going forward. That's why it's going to become even more important, even if not so today, that procurement plays a very, very key cog in the gear wheel of an organization. I will also touch upon one another thing in terms of organization build as well. I would say when I hire people now, right, not everybody wants to become a manager or a director or a VP. You hire what I would call as procurement scientists. They need to have their role being the procurement expert. You create a career path totally on the tactical side. That's what they want to do. They don't want to manage people. They don't want to, become a director or a VP, but they want to do what they want to do really, really well. So you have a separate track for procurement management, which I call strategic sourcing. Then you have a separate track for people that are procurement scientists, which I would like to call, right? That day in and day out, that's what they do in terms of value add. Figure out, ways to cost save, figure out ways to mitigate risk, figure out ways to do things better, figure out ways to actually embrace digital and AI. I think that's where the younger demographics also play a part. The younger guys are not worried about, technology. They're very happy to use technology. So leverage that, hire people that understand AI, that understand, robotic process automation in terms of creating POs and PRs and things like that, that you would normally have people actually type in a PO, PR. I think there are ways that things would change in the future, and that's why procurement becomes a very strategic function, and I would say a very strategic function along with our CFOs in our organizations.
Okay. A very good friend of mine, an experienced procurement leader, Raghavan. Raghavan, we're glad you're here. He's asking, do you see organizations planning to increase major investments being planned for digital procurement, risk, AI solutions, or do you see COVID pushing the slowing of implementations?
Can I answer that?
Anyone can.
Well, I'll go first, and then I have my point of view. I think there'll be a pause, but the pause may not be too long, right? I think the pause is to figure out the demand. How the new ecosystem of not just procurement, it's procurement, logistics, demand and supply planning, all that, the whole supply chain, how it kind of reshapes based on the shape of demand in the future, that will drive some of the IT and AI kind of investments. So I think there'll be a pause. The pause is as long as we know we get a clarity around the future. And I think the investments will be back to make it, dovetail into the new world in terms of both processes, technology, and people. So that would be my kind of a high-level guess.
If I may, I'd like to pile on to that with a couple of other observations. As I was, listening to the other comments and watching the commentary and the observations from all of the participants, there are a couple of things at play here, which I think, even though we're saying COVID is a worldwide impact, there are very different impacts. And in fact, I would argue that for some countries, it's a tremendous opportunity. For instance, the fact that, whether you agree with it or not, and this is not a political discussion, but there are some who feel that, as a result of this pandemic and with some of the attempts made by, some countries to take advantage of it or to sort of deny any responsibility for it, that they're overly exposed to some particular suppliers because they've never really thought about it. You place your order, it comes over on a ship, it comes from that country, maybe you should diversify. There are plenty of opportunities for other suppliers globally to leverage what it is that they have on offer, and stop thinking that, there's only one option. If you need services from this from a country, you go here. If you need manufacturing performed, you go here. But instead to sort of diversify and make their supply chain more resilient. And in some countries, actually, there are probably going to be significant impacts one on the other. Like the one question that came through about Australia in particular, hits very close to home, because for 30 odd years, Australia has not had a recession. We're probably facing into a very significant impact on the domestic economy here, because a lot of, course corrections that other countries and other economies have had to do, Australia hasn't had to face into, because it was, shielded by, extractives and demand from China that basically spent its way through the global financial crisis and, bought a hell and invested a lot in Australia. The result is, if you've got some countries really suddenly finding themselves on the ropes, and they were actually in rude health just a few months ago, or maybe if not in rude health, at least they were still doing pretty well. I think the final impacts have yet to be ascertained. I think, as one of the Roman writers said, fortune favors the bold. I think in this case, investment in AI and other technologies that help individual decision makers take advantage of what the network knows is going to be much more important in future than we even realize now. Because most of us, if we do, reverse e-auctions and things like that, well, that's interesting, but does that really get you the kind of resilience and the sort of robustness in your supply chain that you're after? And the short answer is no. I think there's going to be a whole lot of people looking up and scanning the horizon more so than they ever used to, because it tended to be that you looked at the steps right in front of you and you said, well, as long as I am on firm ground there, I'm going in a good direction. Now I think there are going to be a lot, and I think it's across industries, it's across supply chain sourcing and procurement, and I think it's across geographies as well. I don't know if anyone else shares that view, but I'm really convinced of it based on what I've seen.
Okay, and in the meanwhile, we have Pankaj Bhargav joining us today. Pankaj is the President of Procurement at Pidilite. Welcome, Pankaj.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So we're discussing right now how has been the investment. What are we seeing? Are we seeing organizations to plan an increase in major investments for digital procurement risk or AI solutions? Or do we see COVID pushing the slowing of such implementation? So we're left with your views and Suresh's views. So Suresh,
Yeah, Raju? Yeah. So from my point of view, yeah, most of the organization, they stopped investing on the particularly on the technology and AI part. So, but this is not a long-term solution. Might be the next year, maybe the 6 months or 1 year, they might be. Since anyway, the demand is going to increase in the market, definitely you're going to do the digitalization. We cannot able to do everything in the manual over the period. So the business is going to be normalcy very soon. Then after that, their investment is going to happen again. since the people has to come back to work, obviously. So now the people are sitting at home, so there is no technology necessary for them. They can just work from whatever the limited technology at home. And I don't think everybody is working as per that office hours. Since the entire world is stuck, there is no much work to everyone to work from their home. So now they're planning for their futures. So how is going to be after 3 months or after 6 months, and how we are going to ready for that period. So might be there's a temporarily everything is stopped in most of the industries. So, but as I said, it's not a long-term solution. So very soon, most of the companies, the topmost companies, they're looking for a technological base, which is more important in procurement industry.
Also, Pankaj, your views on this?
So in my view, this is the right time to do some digital investments, because you have it depends on the condition of the organization also, and kind of investments that are. But in my view, this is the right time to do digital investments and be ready for the future, because you have the there is, as of now, especially in India, less amount of work, in a sense, operational work, so you can concentrate, strategize, and do digitization of procurement.
Okay. And if you will have to summarize as we navigate through this time, what could be your immediate actions, and then your midterm actions, and then your long-term actions, or the goals that you want to achieve?
So it depends on the situation. So the short-term actions is basically it just stopped. These operations suddenly stopped. So you would have to review your pending orders. You would have to assess the future demand. You would know which businesses are just picking up. You would look at obsolescence, which is a near expiry item. So in short term, you are looking at conserving cash. And in midterm, what you're looking at is renegotiating contracts, with some basic inputs moving down in terms of crude or other inputs. You renegotiate contracts. You look at, if you are in partnership with vendors, you look at your fixed cost reduction. How do you reduce fixed costs for vendors? How do you work with them to reduce it? What help can you provide them? And I think long term is basically the whole strategic initiative. So one has to look at the category construct, the improvements there, process improvements. Look at talent management. How can you sort of beef up the talent management? So all these things will go in tandem, but this is like a long term might be 1.5 years, and short term might be you would have done in the last 2-3 months, and the midterm would be right now what you would be doing. That's my view.
Steve, your short-term, midterm, and long-term goals, please.
Oh gosh, I feel like I've just been cross-examined by my boss at my mid-year review. It's kind of funny because I could give a joking response to that, but that's actually it's not actually a joke. My short-term, medium-term, and long-term is I want to save as much money as possible. I want to anticipate everything that is impossible to anticipate so that I can avoid it. I want to identify trends earlier than everyone else so that I can ride that wave, for the fullest extent. And I mean, the list of superlatives goes on. But actually applying a bit more of a business-like view on that, I think short, medium, and long term. Short term, obviously, you want to make sure that you have addressed specifically what's broken. Medium term, and I actually would suggest that short term is probably anything within the next 3 to 6 months. Medium term is up to a year, and maybe longer term is a year or 12 or 18 months and onward. The medium term, I would actually want to make sure that I've strengthened those other connections that I talked about, namely that we are really trying to price in, or at least quantify in some way, what it means to get to have timeliness affected or impacted value left on the table and quality of outcomes sacrificed because we weren't thinking about things as holistically as we could. Long term, I would actually want to take advantage of a number of technological innovations, and there's been some comment about what the role of e-procurement and what that means for the sorts of skill sets that people are bringing to the table.
Please. The fire alarm has been activated in the building, and we're investigating the situation right now.
Sorry, that the fire is not in my place, but apparently in someone else's.
That's the new normal.
Exactly. That's just a test to see if we're paying attention. I think longer term, the real magical outcome is thoughtful and interesting use of technology, not just applying technology because there's this nifty new thing that everybody's jumping on. There was a paper that I read from a couple of economists at Oxford that basically said the net impact of technology and implementation of things like AI in the workplace for most people is going to be that, it's not that everybody loses their job and the jobs all go away. Rather, it frees people up, and I'm really looking forward to this. Unfortunately, I may have retired by the time it really is obvious in the marketplace that there are three things that you cannot automate. That is customer service, like real connection with your customers and suppliers. There's no substitute for this sort of interaction that we're having here. Creativity and innovation, you can't automate innovation. It still comes down to somebody having, as they're drying off, coming out of the shower, suddenly they have a brilliant idea and they go scribble it down and it's the next best thing. The kind of, well, basically what it is that you think of when you think of like what's really liberating work. I think there's a mistake that a lot of companies make where they say, well, I'm going to automate a particular group or a function out of existence. That shouldn't be the case. What you'd want to do is you'd want to make sure that you're not having a lot of people do soul-destroying repetitive work, because that's what robots and that's what computers are good at. They're difference engines. They can come up with the same result, the same analysis every time, whereas human beings don't do that. But that's actually the reason why you want human beings looking at trends or looking at what they're seeing coming out of the tools going, you know what, I see something interesting here. I want to press in on that. So, we actually get dumb when we are beaten over the head with the same thing day after day. And anybody who says, well, my procurement team is a bunch of Muppets and they can't seem to figure out up from down, it's probably because you just have them processing things because you don't want to make that investment in technology. Long term, what I would like to see happen is a thoughtful implementation of technology. So I actually empower and free my people to actually have those conversations like the earlier gentleman who unfortunately had to go, where you say, actually, respectfully, I don't agree, or, there's a different way to look at this, because that's where we add value, not by processing a volume of, POs or just moving things off our desks. We're not robots and we shouldn't think of ourselves as such. And so longer term, that's where I think, huge transformative value can still come.
Correct. Suresh, your views on this, three goals.
Yeah, so the short term, as everyone said, as Steve rightly said, we are in a midterm appraisal period. So, but nothing is going to happen for this year. So I need to motivate my team first. So how we are going to, since everybody is waiting for their appraisals and increments and all these things. So anyway, that is not going to happen. So people have to live in this industry. There is no other way. So, and the current market also not that much great to move. So people has to live. So I need to motivate the team first level. That is more important as a short-term action. And again, we need to revisit the contract. Please. That is the most important. Sorry guys, there is the alarm from our side only. Notification.
It's good news that it's good news that was a false alarm. That's one less short-term thing you have to worry about.
Exactly. And the midterm, so what we are just focusing more onto this, the cash flow management. So how we can just plan for this whole year and what the incompleted projects, how we are going to complete with the cash flow management. And there's alternative sources of supply. So where we can just try to close instead of the importing. So we are just trying to close it with a made in India concept. So how we can just consider the shifts to the local suppliers where operationally feasible and social viable. And focusing on inventory optimization, as I earlier said, and double down the responsibility for the interventions and minimize unnecessary spending. That is more important. This is an opportunity in all the verticals of the in the organization. We can reduce the cost. So it's not only in the construction point. I'm telling this is a capital investment and the operational costs, and again that overhead cost, what we are just spending in the brand and marketing and every category. So how we are just trying to the unnecessary spending can be minimized. And shifting their goals and priorities of the employees are more important. Focusing them might be very soon the procurement team is going to be lean. If there's any layoffs is going to happen and this pay cut is happening, people will move out. So a lot of things. So how the KPI is to be revisited with all the employees in the midterm means that 6 to 12 months time, we need to revisit the entire KPIs with the revised numbers and achieve goals based on the organization goals. And again, as I said initially, the timeline management is more important. So current pandemic, that construction time is going to increase, almost is going to be double. So how we are managing that timeline with the management. So this is the revised thinking we are just looking. And again, the vendor point of view, we are just looking to initiate the BCP as one of the major clauses according to all other contract clauses. So the BCP with their plan with the BCP. Since now most of the vendors, they're taking the one way around. Everyone knows a COVID closure. So how is any emergency services, how we are going to come out with this COVID, that is more important. So that is the midterm strategy. On long term, we are just looking for a long-term strategic partners. So how we are going to mitigate the issues on who were supported in this COVID scenario under whatever based on their existing volume of business and the services category. We are going to lean the team, lean the size of the vendors, and we are just very keen into focusing. Since anyway the cost of the raw material is going to increase, and we are just focusing more on the volume business. So we are planning to go with the transparency model instead of going with the negotiation in each vendor in the hide and seek business. We are going with the transparent model. This is the material cost, this is the supply chain cost, this is the logistic cost, this is the profit. So what will be the profit you can go to reduce instead of this product cost? We are just planning to go with the profit negotiation basis. So it will be very transparent across the board. Even 3 vendors, instead of 10 vendors, I'm going with 3 vendors. The volume will be distributed equally. So this is the product cost. What will be your margin? You are looking into this. So this is the way we are just planning for the longer time.
Okay. Nat, your goals and your plan of action to achieve 3 terms. Nat, you put yourself on.
You're muted.
Yes.
All right, there you go. Sorry about that. I'll answer this question from a manufacturing standpoint of view because I think you guys, between the other speakers, we have covered the other industries as well. For me, really, the short term, if you think about really short term, is to first keep your employees safe, your team safe, your manufacturing employees safe, so that they can come and work safely with the new norms of social distancing and sanitizing and all that, and preserve cash, and don't run out of inventory, right? So those are the 3 really, really short-term, aspirations that we have to make sure that our operations are safely able to come back online again, and we are still able to produce the product at the safety level and the quality level that we have been able to produce, right? So that will be the short term itself is a very subjective term. We don't know how long is long on the short term. The medium term will be really when I say, when we know that, generally we have passed the COVID, stage of planning, right? The midterm, like Pankaj and Suresh had said, that would be the opportunity to maybe relook at certain contracts to make sure that we fine-tune those with what we've learned through this crisis. But more importantly, my midterm goal would be to actually study the demand shift. As a building materials industry, maybe the whole, we don't know yet what we don't know in terms of how the demand is going to shift in the marketplace globally. So that is something that we need to study well, so that we know how we are structured, as well as how we will be able to create strategies on the procurement.
I reckon we're
All
facing
I think
some
all
issue for Nat.
when it, can you hear me now?
Nat,
I'm,
Nat, I reckon we're facing some connectivity issues from your end.
do you hear me now?
Nah, your voice is not coming out clear. I reckon there's some connectivity issue at your end.
Okay, so let me try to re-log in at
We
this point.
we'd add some time, and in the meantime, I just I reckon it's clear with you now. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, on the long-term, solution, I think I agree with all the speakers here. When it comes to investment in technology, and when it comes to investment in our people, I always say, let's be aspirational, but let's be selectively aspirational. Let's invest in what makes sense, not just the new Cadillac standing there, right? So sometimes we get carried away by technology, but I think most procurement professionals that way are pretty grounded. We call ourselves procurement professionals first before we understand IT. So I usually am very, very selective in terms of what really is going to add value to to what we do in terms of sourcing, right? So from a long-term perspective, it's more of have we covered our risks enough in terms of diversifying our supply base, and have we put in place the right organization and right technologies in place to make supply chain and procurement function at a more effective level, given the new market dynamics.
Makes a good point. Pankaj, I'd move on to you, and this is towards the next such thing that may hit us anytime, and uh, the next such pandemic will be no less a shocker. But the right plans can keep it from causing as much disruption as what COVID-19 did, because it's clear from the economic fallout that we weren't prepared. Now, what are your thoughts in this regard? And if you'd be working on setting up such emergency plans for the future, what will be your areas of priority? Pankaj, your views.
So I think, Razum, the point is about business continuity. I think this pandemic has taught us that you cannot assume anything to be certain. So when and just to give a context, when it was happening in China or Europe, we were, as normal things, we would prepare for, if China is going down, what are our supplies from China? Can we beef up stocks?
Attention,
Can we look
please.
at
Fire alarm has
alternate
been
supplies?
activated in the building.
There is another fire alarm. Okay.
Steve, you can, in the meantime, you can put yourself on mute as well. There's an option that wouldn't allow the background to come here. Yes,
So
Pankaj.
yeah, so when we were looking at China and air is spreading in China, we were looking at beefing up stocks. We were looking at alternate suppliers. All those things were being done, and nobody thought it will hit India. In a sense, we were unprepared. I think it's a
Yeah.
very relevant question that you have raised. The learnings from this is about planning for business continuity. So and business continuity, business continuity, not only for yourself, for your suppliers and your partners. So I think what one needs to prepare for is a full risk analysis that one needs to do. The risk is about geographical risk. Geographical risk is not only the country specific risk across country, it is within India. You have today, what are the issues that one faces? If your vendor is in a red zone, then there is no supply from the vendor. So even from a country specific, you would have to look at from a geography perspective, that with geography, you need to have supply bases across geographies. India is a big country. So, that's one learning that is coming. One is about business continuity. Second is about people, and how So this is like a pilot for us in terms of remote working and how we can work. But I would feel that what kind of skills we would need in people in terms of managing a pandemic is another area that we need to dwell on. So one is about, so two areas that I see here is, one is about risk management and putting up business continuity plans, not only for you, for your supply base. And second area is preparing your people, training them or giving them insights in terms of how would one act when the next pandemic occurs or the next wave occurs. I think both are possible.
Yes. This, just to add on to what you've said, and I think Shailesh did mention this before, that we were accustomed, as procurement people, we were accustomed to be running unseen in the background of everyday life. Uh, what the coronavirus did, it brought us into the forefront. But for supply chain leaders, the pandemic has shifted focus from business as usual to crisis management. Uh, this is completely unprecedented. Now, as sourcing relates to China, it's going to change. There's a strategy that's being termed as China plus one strategy that has been tossed around in the world of think tanks for over a year now, but it's getting a little bit more push and attention as a result of the pandemic. So, Pankaj, do you think the concept that we can't have all our eggs in one basket will become true? And would that mean less efficiency and more cost? So, what are your thoughts?
So you are absolutely right, Azum. You would have to diversify your supply base because the risk it has exposed. And if you look at the risk that was happening in February, March, before it hit us, Jan, Feb, March, it was all about China supplies. So you obviously have to have supply bases across the world and diversify them. To your point about efficiency, etc. Today, if you look at what's happening in China, they've reduced their VAT on certain things. They are being very competitive right now. So if you diversify or even you start with a new supplier across the geography from China with a smaller share of business, obviously there would be efficiencies of procurement hit because China is a very strong price base in that sense, if I can say. So
Hmm.
there would be probabilities, but what I would say is that over a period of time, people will become competitive. Vendors will across the world will become competitive. That might take 1.5, 2 years, but diversification of supplies has to happen. So if you are solely 100% dependent on China, you would move at least some supply with outside China. That's an imperative.
And if I may put this in this way, does that mean that we need to accept this reality and we cannot procrastinate this and work hard to mitigate?
Yeah, obviously, because this is the first element of risk management in a sense, because your business continuity would be hit. So what was happening between January to March was a nightmare in terms of if you were running out of stocks from China. Because see, let us understand what happened in China, and it happened for the first time there. They had a total shutdown. Their ports were unoperational for quite a while. Shipping lines were not ready to go to China. So it was a impact which was long lasting. Even to even now, it is picking up in a sense. The supplies can be taken, but there was even if if your source is down, see there is a transit time, Raghu. Suppose there the transit time from China in a normal sense, from a shipping line, not air, I'm saying, is around 30 to 45 days, and you don't
Right.
have if you don't have that cover and you don't have the comfort, the agility to manage their supply, then you are taking too much of a risk from a business continuity.
Right. Uh, Steve, your views on this?
I I think actually the approach that we've been talking about in terms of who to buy from China, it's interesting to consider because especially in having conversations with, some of my stakeholders internally and also peers, elsewhere in Australia and frankly, globally. The really surprising piece is that they're so shocked that with most of their supplier base concentrated in one geography or one country, that they suddenly had challenges when that country was impacted by, the pandemic first and foremost. And it's interesting because if you lean back and you think about what that really means, we've, the whole time that we talk about things like strategic engagement and, resiliency of supply chain and, blah, blah, blah. Have we really changed how it is we do what we do? And I would suggest that actually for all of the, time that we spend having really interesting conversations like this one, we don't actually step back and go, this is how I'm going to turn what it is that I've just learned into practice, and I'm going to start doing things differently. And again, I still come back to the same idea that, we talk about price as the four most important things of, any vendor relationship, followed distantly by, other whatever based on your industry you think is important. I as much as we recognize that, it is so difficult to actually implement, that I think a lot of times we just kind of stumble into what is a blind alley, and we don't actually see it coming until suddenly we realize there's nowhere to go, and we're so far into it, it's tough to back out. I think this is a wake-up call for a lot of us, to the extent that we didn't realize it before, or maybe we thought well we can wait, and it's not really super urgent. I actually look forward to seeing how it is that this plays out, because honestly, as countries become more dependent on suppliers abroad for more and more things, I think we've seen this in some of the developed, as well as developing countries. There are suddenly gaps where you would expect to see prosperity, et cetera, and it's not there because those jobs have actually gone elsewhere. In addition to doing well for our companies and our countries, I think it's important to recognize that there's an element of doing good, that we should actually really have in mind, not only because we're coming up with a good outcome for our companies and delivering on savings, but also that we're talking about the results we deliver in a more balanced way than just to say, here attached, please find the spreadsheet that proves that our RFP process delivered the cheapest outcome given the criteria. Thank you very much. Please approve, and then we'll issue the POs accordingly. I think this is actually really my core takeaway from the entire experience of COVID-19, and certainly through the lens of procurement. And I don't know if I've kind of picked on that by lobbing things back to him, but I don't know if he'd have a different view, since he's more supply chain than I am. We only print money. He has to worry about other things.
Nat,
I want to tag on to what Pankaj said, in terms of being dependent on China. So what I would say is what saved us from this pandemic and the supply chain disruptions were the fact that we were not completely reliant on China, right? A couple of years back, when we created the business risk management proposals, part of it was actually to have China plus one or China plus two countries supplying to our vast network of 12 countries, because on some of the key commodities, we were single source from China at that point. So I would completely agree with Pankaj. If companies are not thinking of country plus one, and what I would also say is the country plus one should be the proximity as well. It may be a little bit of a higher cost sometimes, but proximity plays a role. So when I diversified our supply base from China on some key commodities, the next supplier would probably be in the middle of Southeast Asia, somewhere more centrally located, like in Vietnam or Thailand, that would be able to supply to multiple countries in the network. Maybe the unit cost went up a little bit, but the risks are well protected, right? So I completely agree with Pankaj that we need to have a China plus strategy, and having that strategy really helped us get through most of our crises. I won't call it completely, because when we diversified some players where we put them in different regions of China. That didn't help us either, right? So I think China plus maybe a local, nothing like a local supplier, right? If you are able to build local suppliers that can supply quality products to you locally, even at a marginally higher cost, I think the total cost of ownership would still be realized. So I think that's the key takeaway.
Okay. Now we're already ahead of time, and just to get closing comments from everybody, and Pankaj, again, I'd want to get your views in this. Just to do a round robin of things, and to understand from you, since this is a time when we're looking this as an opportunity for procurement to be perceived and to being a value-added center for profit, what is that one thing that you'd recommend chief procurement officers to start doing, and one thing that you recommend them to start doing?
It's a one. When you ask only one, then it becomes a problem in terms of a question. So the main things to start off or be serious about are two things, I would say. One is about business continuity and risk management, and second is talent management. So these are two critical things, I would say, that one needs to start off. And the only thing that I would recommend people not to do is not to take short-term calls. So, it's a one-time situation which has happened. So don't take short-term calls. Be with your suppliers and vendors. Have empathy. Yeah, that's what I would be my comment.
Okay, Nat, your closing comments, please.
Sure. I'll actually add on to Pankaj. I will say a crisis is not a time to strategize. You pass the crisis and then strategize later for the future, both in terms of your own people, your relationships with suppliers, and the general supply chain strategy overall. So if you're strategizing now would be the wrong time. You wait for the crisis to pass so that you know where the pieces fall in place, and then you have the new strategy going forward after that.
Okay, Suresh, your closing comments, please.
Yeah, I can tell one thing here. I'm talking only about the partners. The relationship with partners is more important in this particular situation. So more than a cost negotiation and future businesses, the partnership where they're supported. So we need to continue with them. The relationship with the partners is more important. And same way, the team support is more important to continue the same effort without disturbing their work. So we need to focus more.
All right, I think we've had a great discussion, and we've almost covered all questions. And there are a few questions that remain, but time doesn't allow us. We've already passed to 1:30, and I'm sure this has been a very long discussion over the last 2 hours. Nat, thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate, and this has been a gift that you've shared and given to all our audience today.
No, thanks for having me, and it's also a great learning from the different experiences that I've been able to listen from the different leaders that you have on the panel today.
Suresh, thank you so much as well. Your experience shared over the last couple of hours has been really helpful for all of us.
Thank you. Thanks for adding me in this role.
Yes. And Pankaj, I'm really honored to have you today here. Thank you. I know you have a very hectic schedule at the current time, handling and not strategizing, but to giving actions to whatever intelligent decisions you're taking. I know it's not easy to get answers at this time. And thank you so much. Your views has been really a gift to all our audience today.
Thank you, Razum. Thank you for having me here. It was a pleasure to be part of such a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes. With that, we come to the end of today's forward towards the next phase of the pandemic, and we see what happens at the end of lockdown 4.0, and if there would be a lockdown fifth, I'm not sure what happens, but for all of you there who are in procurement and everybody else, this is an important time. As Nat and everybody said, it's not a time to strategize and do not take decisions based on the short-term impacts and the situations that are there. There has to be a level of preparedness that we do before a pandemic hits, and as a response, we are doing it the best what we can. At CPO Innovation, we are all the time bringing you relevant insights, and we've created a inventory of COVID-19 articles and angles that you can access on cpoinnovation.com. That's all. I was Resume Rajan, your moderator for the day, and I'll be with you again next week for another episode. Thank you. Cheers.